In today's episode, I am going to be diving into a topic that I've covered in pieces on the podcast before, but I really wanted to spend the whole episode just, going deeper into it because it's such a rich topic and there's so much to cover about it. And I mean, there's enough in this for there to be an entire workshop. I've run workshops on this topic before and only scratched the surface, so we'll see where it goes today, but the topic for today is the inner critic and how to navigate the inner critic. And I'm coming to you on day 26 of my cycle today. I'm about 2 days out from my bleed, 3 days out from my bleed probably actually. And I actually was inspired to record this by noting the distinct lack of my critic at the moment. Or not the lack of it, but the gentleness that it has. Now, I mean, gentle I suppose is relative, but compared to how it used to be, because I think when you suffer with PMDD and you experience those symptoms, when you don't have the tools to navigate that and you don't have the tools to meet your critic, it's like it can be really, really savage. And I was actually painting this morning. I was doing this beautiful coastline in Devon and noticed my critic pop up of like, oh, this is crap, it doesn't look how I want it to, and it just kind of got me thinking about how much it used to just be so pervasive and not even pervasive, because I mean, honestly, I found my critic pops up a lot in winter and spring, in my inner winter and my inner spring, but of course, in inner autumn, it just gets so much louder, and especially if you experience PMDD, it's so much louder, and it can be really quite aggressive, I guess. And also, it's worth saying that we often have multiple critics. So the inner critic, in air quotes, is just a marker of like a type of part, I guess. A part of our system, and there are often multiple parts that fall under that category of inner critic, so it's just worth bearing that in mind as you listen to this. So first, let's talk about the role of the inner critic, because this is so misunderstood. I think often the way it's talked about in mindset work and even in psychology and like CBT and stuff like that, it really misunderstands the critic. Because your inner critic is actually a really important part of your system, or your critics, a really important part of your system. And they're really trying to protect you and give you information, and there's so much richness to this. So the simplest way they're trying to protect you is they're trying to get you to not do something, right? Like, no, you look stupid, or no, that's rubbish, you can't tell people about that, or no, you can't say that, or, you know, this kind of like censoring or filtering of like what you do and don't do, and what you attempt and what you don't attempt. And it's trying to protect, often they're trying to protect us from failure, right? Or even success, that can be a thing as well. But also our critic can really act as like a compass, you know. I mean, in previous episodes I've said our anger can act as a compass. Our inner critic can as well. It can highlight places where we have an edge to grow into. So if there's the critics there's often fear there. There's often like a pushing and expanding of our comfort zone. That tends to be where the critic comes up, right? And that can be really useful information, because actually can be a guide. You can kind of go, oh, okay, this actually feels really edgy for me. And actually that's where that growth can happen. Again, obviously staying within that safety zone. But regardless of how, I guess, maladaptive, because obviously there are situations where your critic is super helpful and you're like, oh yeah, I can see the gold in this. And there are other times where it's just like absolutely beating you up and berating you, and it's just horrific. And you're just like, you might be sat here listening to this and you're like, what the fuck is she talking about? Like, my critic this is not helpful. Like, it's horrendous. And again, it's just doing a job of trying to protect you. And it's so important to not villainize that, because at some point in time this part has formed to protect you from something that was a genuine threat, right? Whether that's to your emotional well-being, your mental well-being, your physical well-being, anything like that, like social well-being as well, like social exclusion. Our critic is often revolved around trying to make sure that we fit in and we have that societal social inclusion, because that's been, so essential for our survival, but particularly in that kind of, the limbic brain, and when you think back to how we used to live, like actually we had to live in tribes, and that was really important to be part of the tribe. And the thing is, even when our critic is being loud and bullshit and how do we put it, can feel like it's so harmful or is so harmful, there's often a 1% truth in it. And now I'm going to come on to what that 1% truth can be, because it's not always as direct as like your critic is saying you're a shitty person and there's like a 1% truth that you're a shitty person. That's not what I mean. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But the critic has this really important role, and actually if we didn't have a critic, like no critic whatsoever, we just become grandiose narcissists, right? Like, it keeps us accountable to who we are. And the key thing is that when you start to work with it, it starts to be like a collaborative, creative relationship rather than, oh my God, my critic is beating me up and this is absolutely horrific. It gets to be a part of you that you set boundaries with, that you collaborate with, that you can, perhaps invite it into a slightly different role by showing it that you're listening, And so this leads me on to how to navigate your critic in your premenstrual phase. So your critic is so loud often for many of us in our premenstrual phase because it's the natural home of the critic. Inner autumn, as I've said in previous episodes, is all about the truth and bringing the shadow into the light and showing us, the shit that we maybe don't want to see. And so, of course, the critic, if that is holding a 1% truth, if it is highlighting something to us where we are perhaps not in alignment with ourselves, or, there is some healing to do perhaps, that is a truth. Like that's highlighting that to us, right? I'll use an example. So like actually a really good example of a truth is, and this is kind of outside the context of PMDD, but it's a more kind of gentle context to show you how it can become. So this morning I'm painting, right, like I said, and I noticed my critic come up and it's like, oh, it's not quite as good, and and oh, I wish I hadn't, I made a brush stroke and I was like, oh, that's shit, and that's ruined the painting. And notice how it's like very like, oh my God, it's ruined the painting, and it was like one brush stroke, it was fine. But that's feedback for me on two levels. So this is giving me information, and like by being with my critic, I know, one, maybe I would make a different artistic choice there right next time. Like maybe I wouldn't make that brush stroke. Maybe I wouldn't do that. And two, it's actually showing me that I am a bit of a perfectionist, and that is something to look at, right? It's going, oh, well, that's just shit. And it's like, oh, my love, you're really scared that like this painting isn't going to be a freaking Picasso. Oh, wow, that's so interesting. And you can kind of turn towards it instead of turning away from it. And again, I'm going to get into this a little bit more. But so in that premenstrual phase, I digress. The premenstrual phase is the natural home of the inner critic, right? So that's why it can get so much louder. And there is some work as well when the inner critic is showing up in other places in your cycle, to kind of redirecting the critic to the home of to its natural home in autumn. Because the other thing is, when you can do that, you can create this buffer by practicing menstrual cycle awareness. You get the deep rest in a winter, you get the playfulness in spring, and then you get to like celebrate yourself and be witnessed in a summer, so that then when you come to inner winter, you have this like buffer to be able to meet the inner critic and go, okay, I can hear you, but like not take this as gospel, not take this as 100% truth. Even though I know that there's a 1% truth in there somewhere, I'm not going to take this at face value. I'm not going to like take it personally, in air quotes, right? So again, I'm digressing into like jumping ahead a little bit of myself into like how to navigate it, but it's just important. So it's so important to notice where our critic is strongest in the context of our cycle, and knowing that the inner autumn is the natural home of the critic. So if you do struggle with that phase a little bit more and you find it more challenging, you have PMS and PMDD, working with the inner critic is something that is really, really important to kind of wrap your head around, I guess. And this is probably a good point at which to say that like there's a lot of stuff, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but like around ignoring your critic or like positive affirmationing over the top of it, and it just, I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it just doesn't work. It's like, yeah, I know I'm not a piece of shit, but there's a voice in my head that like will not stop telling me that, and it's really hard to like just positive affirmation your way out of that, or CBT your way out of that. And I think this is where there needs to be a two-prong approach. So there's the like bigging yourself up in those other seasons of your menstrual cycle and going like, yes, I am, you know, I've got this, and having that buffer, that like reserve that you can draw on, right? But then also doing the deeper work of working with your critic and turning towards it and going, okay, I see you for the scared part of me that you are. You're scared of rejection, you're scared of being shamed, you're scared of being outcast, you're scared of failure, you know, all of these. There's often like a lot of fear around the critic. There's often fear driving the critic, and seeing it in that light rather than going, oh fuck this part, you know, villainizing it again. So when we think about working with the critic, I've kind of already alluded to this, like seeing it in the context of the menstrual cycle, right? And I think it can be really worthwhile, specifically if you really struggle with your inner critic, specifically tracking on what days it shows up, and when you notice you have a you could call it like an inner critic attack, right? When you're having a critic attack and you're like, oh, okay, that's what that is. And remember, it doesn't always show up as this kind of like, kind of having a go at yourself, or like this like angry voice inside your head. It can just be like, oh, well, I can't really be bothered to do that because like it'll be shit anyway. And, you know, it can kind of have like a different tone to it. So noting down what days in your cycle the critic shows up and how it's showing up, right? How it's what's its tone, what's the voice like how does your body feel with it? So I've talked a little bit about that, but I'm going to go into some kind of points to really talk about how to like really specifically work with the critic. I'm not going to focus so much on the like menstrual cycle awareness side of it in terms of working with the other phases of the cycle, because there are previous episodes on that. But yeah, let's dive into some kind of, I guess, tools and like thoughts and mindset shifts to really help you build a relationship with your critics so that you can be the one in charge of that relationship and driving the dynamic, rather than just kind of feeling like you're getting beaten up by it all the time. So the first one is to know your triggers. This is so valuable. So whether this is a specific day of your cycle, so for me at the moment, I notice that I can have a little bit of a critic attack around day 6 of my cycle. So just as I'm coming out of my winter and into my spring, I notice that there is a bit of a critic telling me to rush and telling me, oh, you gotta go and get everything done now. And so I know that day 6 is a bit of a trigger for me. I know that there's something that happens at day 6 where my critic is going to show up. So I'm prepared on that day as much as I can. Obviously, sometimes life gets in the way, but I'm prepared to go, okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time being with the critic. I'm going to like really just be quite conscious and aware of my thoughts and where that's going, and just kind of keep an eye on it. You can even mark it in your calendar, right? But then in terms of knowing your triggers, I also mean, you know, in general day-to-day life. So in the past, I, and still to some extent, have struggled when I receive feedback in my relationship that kind of challenges my view of myself. So if you believe that you are, you know, you have this, not that you believe that you're a nice person, that's not what I mean, but if you have this like very strong identity of like being a kind person, and someone tells you you've done something not very kind, the critic can pop up with this shame and this, oh my God. But for me, when that has turned up in the past, it doesn't come out as like, oh my God, I'm so disappointed in myself and I feel so ashamed. It comes out as defensiveness. So, knowing your triggers in terms of, okay, I know that if my partner brings something up like that, that might trigger a critic attack, and I might just need to take a little look at that, or, maybe doing something new. So like some days, if I am speaking on a topic that feels a little bit edgy for me with my on my podcast or whatever, that's I'm looking out for my critic. I'm going, okay, you might show up and that's okay, and just being prepared to be with that and notice that a little bit more, being a little bit on it with kind of noticing it. First thing in the morning, that can be another time. So it's these triggers are kind of things that happen and also times. First thing in the morning, I can't remember who it was, but someone once said to me, yeah, the critic rises before you do. It's very true. So there can be these like liminal times where, or, right after you've just done something really vulnerable, right after you've just given a talk or you've just shared something really vulnerable with a friend, that's a really vulnerable space for the critic to kind of pop up. So being aware of that. And then also, things that you do. So like maybe you're pushing the boat out with like, you're trying something new, maybe you're one of the people that when you try something new, your critic pops up. Maybe it's in the context of relationships. Maybe it's just simply knowing, right, I'm in my inner autumn and my critic gets a little bit angry with me right now, so there are ways that you can track this, and then you can start to look at it and go, okay, I know what this is. And I just think like knowing what it is and being able to get that separation from the critic part rather than it just consuming you, just creating that space and focusing on that, increasing the space. So we're not focusing on getting rid of the critic, we're just focusing on increasing the space between us and the critic, or us and the thoughts, or us and the emotion, however you want to, conceptualize it. That is so powerful for just relieving some of the suffering. It doesn't get rid of the critic, it doesn't get rid of the thoughts, but it means that we're no longer suffering at the hands of them. And then the next one is setting boundaries with the critic, and when it isn't allowed to be seen, have a voice, where it's not allowed to kind of be at play. And there's some nuance to this, because like we were just saying about the timings of things and where it is and isn't allowed to show up, and especially in the context of menstrual cycle awareness, there, with the inner autumn being the natural home of the critic, there is this concept or this idea that we should, if the critic pops up at any other time in the cycle, we should ask it to go back to inner autumn. We should ask it just wait for me at inner autumn, not right now. And I think this is a beautiful idea, and if it works, fantastic. And sometimes you can do it. Sometimes you can go, okay, if this is important, we can revisit in inner autumn. And from the lens of internal family systems, which is one of my favourite, models, and this is where all the parts stuff that I talk about comes from. If that inner critic is being triggered at that point in time, it's because there's something valuable for it to say. And so there's some nuance with this where sometimes you might ask your critic to go back to inner autumn, but it won't. It's like, no, this is important and I need to tell you this now. And it's really important to honour that. And I think that as you build your capacity to be with your critic and build your capacity to be with these parts and practice that menstrual cycle awareness and practice those skills of creating that distance between you and the critic so that you can listen to it becomes more feasible, I guess, to be able to be with it in that moment. And it also might become easier to send it to inner autumn. So you kind of need to feel into this one. What I would never want to encourage is just like slapping a plaster on it for the rest of, your menstrual cycle and never listening to the critic or parts that get triggered, and just trying to like suppress them and push them away and go, oh, for fuck's sake, you're not meant to be coming up here in inner spring, like, can you just fuck off, kind of thing, and getting angry with that critic for popping up. I would never want to encourage that and then trying to suppress it. I would never, I don't think that is a helpful approach. But if you can lovingly and gently set that boundary and go, hey, like, I really hear that you're scared right now, I really see you, and I get that you're trying to, give me a really important message here, but actually this is really not a good time. And, this can apply in life as well. Like maybe you're about to go out on stage and give a talk to a crowd and your critic's like popping up and you're like, okay, this is not a good time. You can't sit and listen to it. So there's a balance, I guess, is what I'm saying, between setting boundaries with the critic and going, not now, thank you. And yeah, listening to it. And that's something that you can feel into, and also feel into with a practitioner as well. That can be really, really helpful to helping you discern when to listen to it and when to kind of step away. And then that kind of leads me nicely on to the other point, is kind of, I guess, instead of trying to go, oh, no, like in how you set these boundaries, it's not like going like, oh, no, go away, you're not meant to be here. It's actually being really compassionate with this part, knowing that it's trying to protect you, know that it is like probably quite a young part of you trying to just do its best to keep you safe. And to kind of, I guess, demonstrate this or illustrate this, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is. Again, I'm three days out of my bleed, so I'm not like the most eloquent in my cycle right now. So me and my partner have this thing with our dog where we've been trying to, so we live in a flat and we are trying to teach her to not bark at people, basically. But we noticed that when we said no, it felt like really like, no, and it didn't feel right, because ultimately, like, she's trying to protect us. Like, we don't want her to just not ever bark. Like, if there is, some kind of suspicious person like lurking around outside the flat, like, we want her to bark at them. We want her to know, we want her to protect her space, and she naturally wants to do that as well, right? Dogs are very territorial. So she's kind of just doing her job from her perspective. Notice the relation between your inner critic. It's just trying to do its job. So we changed from going, no, don't bark, no barking, to saying thank you. And obviously from her perspective, she's a dog, she doesn't know. But the way that it just shifted the way that we handled it. It didn't shift the way, well, actually it did shift the way she responded. She actually responded much better to it. I think that's kind of the point. But because it shifted the way, that happened because we shifted the way that we kind of were talking about it. We were going, okay, thank you, thanks for letting us know, and then giving her a treat when she'd quietened down. And so now she'll bark, but then we'll go, thank you, and then she'll stop. So it's like she's alerting us, but then we're just like, okay, thanks. Yeah, thank you for letting us know. I can see that. I see that Mr. Amazon is outside. I see that DPD is delivering something. Right? I see the postman. Thank you for letting me know that the postman's there. And it's the same with the critic, is going, oh, thanks for letting me know. Thanks for just highlighting that. Really, like me with this morning with my art. Yeah, you're right. I probably wouldn't have made that brush mark. If I could go back and do it again, I'd maybe choose differently, but that's all part of the learning process. But thank you for highlighting that, because now I can learn from it, right? If you didn't have that there, if you didn't have any sort of feedback system, it would just be like, you can never learn anything. You'd never improve anything. And I know that this is hard when it's not just your critic going, oh, I'm making a brush mark. Like, and trust me, I totally understand. I have had working with my inner critics, because I have multiple, has been a lifelong journey for me so far. And I'm still continuing to do the work with it. And it's one of the ways, that my PMDD was just, really bad when it was at its worst before I started doing all this work. And I really understand that, when that critic is telling you to just like isolate yourself, or that you're like the worst person in the world or whatever, it's not so easy as going, oh, thanks for letting me know that, critic. But it's just like this practice of going, okay, thank you, I can hear you. I hear that there is something you want to tell me right now, and thank you for communicating with me. And the reason we do this is because the more that you acknowledge the critic, the less loud it gets, the less all-consuming it gets. So I'm not saying that it's going to suddenly start like, writing you poetry and writing you a love letter instead of, berating you. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that you can start to get more distance from it, so you can just separate that voice and go, I see you. I know what this is, and I know that this is not necessarily 100% true. Like, I know to just create a bit of distance from it. And this takes practice. And of course, there's deeper work that sometimes need to be done as well with this. So that's the other thing with the critic, is often if you are tracking your menstrual cycle, and I have this with clients, and if you are kind of trying to be with the critic, and sometimes I work with people in a one-to-one setting and we're working with the critic, and I go, do you know what, I think you could really benefit from actually going a little bit deeper with this, going a bit deeper with the critic with a therapist. And I specifically recommend internal family systems therapy, or IFS therapy. I'm really working with that part. I'm really starting to understand what is going on in your system and where that has come from, and how to kind of relieve some of the weight in the critic. Especially if your critic shows up as thoughts of, suicide or self-harm. It's really, really important to do that deeper work as well, alongside this kind of menstrual cycle informed approach. And I just wanted to tell you another little, I guess, surprising example of where back in my PMDD, the depths of my PMDD days, where my critic was honestly highlighting something, I guess, kind of surprising. And so it was another situation. It was in my relationship, and I'd received some feedback from my partner, and I was really struggling to receive it and feeling really defensive and a lot of shame around it. And because I was feeling that so intensely, I was struggling to kind of, I guess, take it on board and like digest the feedback, and then actually kind of, listen to him and offer, compassion towards him and an apology and all of that. And it was so interesting, because looking back on it now, I can see that critic, the only reason the critic was there was because that there was truth in what he was saying to me, and it triggered the shit out of me. And it was really highlighting that to me. And by being with the critic, I found the 1% truth. So it wasn't like, oh my God, you're the worst person ever. That wasn't the truth. But the truth was, actually, I really don't like that I've done that. That's not in alignment with who I am, and that's not how I want to treat my partner. So actually, I'm going to change my behavior. So that's like the 1% truth thing, right? Is looking for that 1% truth of like, how is what my critic's saying either teaching me something, highlighting something that needs to be healed, or showing me where I have acted out of alignment with myself, right? Out of alignment with who I really want to be and how I really want to conduct myself in the world. So it's super, super important in that sense. And so in terms of the actual process of being with your inner critic, right? So doing this work of like the 1% and maybe asking it, to go to autumn if it can wait, or even just waiting an hour until you've done the thing that you're trying to do. In terms of the actual process of that, I have a free premenstrual survival pack. If you haven't got it already, that'll be in the show notes. And in there is an audio version and also a written version of the process that you can go through, with really spending some time to listen to your inner critic. So you can either do it as a meditation and pause it just and sort of meditate on the questions and be with the part and the sensation, or you can do it as a journal exercise. I love doing it as a journal exercise. When my critic shows up, I'm like, okay, this is curious. I either do it as a journaling exercise, or I go and sit with a tree and meditate on it. And I don't tend to, you don't have to, follow the exact structure that I've given. It's just a really nice framework to use when you're first starting to work with the critic. It's nice to have like a step-by-step thing to follow, but once you kind of exercise that muscle, this is a muscle. Once you've started to exercise that, you can kind of start to follow your intuition with like where your critic is guiding you, and how you can be there for your critic and maybe soothe it as well, because sometimes the critic just needs like a little bit of reassurance, like you go, no, it's okay, like we're not a horrible person. We're not horrible, we made a mistake, we're not a horrible person, and I hear you and I'm here. And or if it's like, this is really scary right now, but we're going to be okay, this is safe to do, sometimes it just needs that reassurance. So that can be the 1% truth as well. So it's just nice to have a framework. So if you would like to, you can grab that in the show notes. It's completely free, and there's an audio version that you can download and have on your phone, or there's a written version. And then the other thing that can really help is to have someone like actually, kind of work through this with you, or help you in the holding of your critic, and help you do that process of being with the critic in person, right? Or not in person, online, but there's another person there helping you just provide the support to be able to really go in there and ask the questions and reflect back to you and that kind of thing. And that's what a premenstrual processing session is for. So that's a 90-minute one-to-one session with me. That's one of the things that we can do, is work with the inner critic. And I think sometimes being witnessed in it is really powerful, because it can kind of take a little bit of the weight out of it. And again, if you are really, really struggling with, those really deep, dark thoughts with the critic of like, I just, the world would just be better without me and all of that. And again, I totally get it. I've been there. I really would recommend looking into internal family systems therapy. It's just amazing. It's fantastic. And it really complements the menstruality work as well. If you are enjoying working with your menstrual cycle and, seeing all the different ways it can pop up, that's really, really important. And I think I just want to emphasize again that it's totally okay if your critic is popping up at other points in your cycle. If you're struggling with PMDD and PMS, you're probably focused on that part of your cycle and seeing it there. But it is worth noticing where else it shows up, because now for me, actually, in my inner autumn, it's kind of easier for me to be with my critic. It kind of feels natural. It's like, I know how to do this. I know how to be with my premenstrual anger and frustration and critic and, all of the stuff when it does come up. But also it can feel a bit less natural to meet the critic in other places. And it's really worthwhile noting where it pops up. And something that's really common, and was certainly my experiences in a winter, so when you're on your bleed, resting can tend to be a trigger for the inner critic. Certainly was for me. And I think is for a lot of people, because of the society we live in, right? Especially as people who have been, socialized as women, there's this expectation to, always be on the go and all of that. So that can trigger it. And then there's also like an element of vulnerability in inner spring. So I mentioned that it pops up for me on day 6 in that transition. There's a vulnerability there because there's this playfulness and also all the childhood stuff can come up in inner spring, right? So there, in response to that vulnerability and that playfulness, there can be like a backlash with the inner critic, and there can be kind of this pendulum swing that happens, and it's like, no, that's not safe, don't do that. And it's really, really valuable to note it. And maybe, there's a middle ground as well with being with the critic. It's maybe a case of like noticing it and noting that I see you and I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to write this down, and I am going to revisit this in my inner autumn, and really making a commitment to do that, because sometimes that's all the critic needs. It just needs that solid commitment that you will come back to it. So if you are someone who is really just like feeling totally hijacked with their inner critic, I just want you to know that it is absolutely possible to build a relationship with your critic where you don't feel that way, where you don't feel like it just totally hijacks your whole self-esteem and drives your actions and keeps you small and just really causes all that suffering. And again, like I said, the first step is creating that distance between you and the critic. And the only way you can do that is by turning towards it. You're not going to create space from your critic by turning away and trying to ignore it and suppress it. So that's, I guess, the thing that I want to leave you with. And also know that this is a journey and it takes a lot of practice. And I want to, just name what can happen when we start trying to manage our critic, is that when we feel we're not doing it well enough, that can be another critic on top of it. It can be another thing to criticize ourselves for. Oh, well, I'm not managing this critic very well. So I really want to name that, so that I guess just something to be aware of. And in those moments where it all just feels too much and, getting space from the critic just feels impossible, and just know that it's enough to just breathe. All you have to do in that moment is breathe. That is enough. That is enough to just breathe and just wait. I was thinking of it as a kid having like a tantrum and just going, okay, they just need to get this out and then we can regulate, and just being with it until it passes, because it does pass. It does always pass. Especially if you can, holding the intention of coming into a conscious relationship with your inner critic. I think it's the intention that's so, so important. And like with all of this menstrual cycle stuff, the intention is so important. It's not necessarily what it looks like on the outside or how quickly things are changing or anything like that. The intention is really, really the important thing. Okay, so that is it for my ramblings on the inner critic. I'm aware that we have kind of meandered a little bit back and forth, and I would love to know, how this is landing, and if there is anything that you'd like clarifying, anything that, any questions that I could answer. Always happy to take questions and turn them into whole podcast episodes or articles or whatever, and answer your questions through my content. I'm always really, really keen to do that. So I am going to leave it there, and thank you for your time in listening.